Emotion, the genie out of the bottle. Man's most civilizing desire is the need of pleasure. His most self-destructive impulse is the need of love. Between these two compulsive longings lies the treacherous ground of emotion, which he often mistakes for both. Let me make it clear what I mean by emotion. Man is being emotional, and therefore not himself, when he chats or thinks about the past, when he tells his troubles to anyone except perhaps a professional consultant or spiritual teacher, both of whom will keep him to the facts, when he gossips about another person, or when he justifies himself or accuses or blames another. To risk seeming to be going to extremes, he is even in danger of being used by emotion when he expects anything from another, or when he makes a statement not in answer to a question direct or implied. In other words, when I speak of emotion, I am not just talking about the stronger feelings of anger, joy, grief, etc. I am referring to something more subtle, yet massively pervasive, something as fundamental and ever-present as the past itself. In fact, emotion is the past itself. Emotion is the past because it originates from instinct, the first driving force of life on earth. Instinct is the desire to survive and live again. The very essence of that is the experience or knowledge of having lived before. Instinct culminates in the expression of animal life, which is so complete and perfect in its unself-conscious artistry. In man, instinct continues to govern his animal responses. But rising to self-consciousness, it becomes emotion, that is, the need to project himself, make an impression on his environment, whether by anger, moods, talk, threat, or desire for recognition, in the form of sympathy and acceptance. Emotion is the self-conscious expression of instinct. As instinct was the driving force behind the development of the animal body to the point where self-consciousness was a future possibility, so emotion was the rising wave on which man traveled out from the psyche finally to become attached to his physical senses and the world as the consciousness of self. Then mainly through conflicting desire, competing emotions. Forcing him to choose and think, it provided the stimulus for the mental development of Homo sapiens to his present creative level of performance. Now that man has realized his senses, entered his body, and ordered his reflective thought processes, emotion as the prime mover of these evolutionary achievements has served its purpose. But like the legendary genie who escaped from the bottle and discovered its enormous power over man, it cunningly refuses to go back into the bottle. Emotion is now man's torment, the main source of his misery and lack of fulfillment. Emotion is living off of him, sucking like a vampire at any excitement it can stir in his sensitivity, and leaving him depressed, discontented, or unfulfilled until he is revitalized and can be used again. Nevertheless, as it was evolution which extracted the cork and let the genie out, so evolution must redress the position. Thus, how to get the emotional genie back into the bottle and put the stopper on for good is now the great evolutionary task of humanity. A huge and growing section of mankind is ready to discover that their emotional living and thinking, for all its apparent seriousness and harmlessness, is no more than pathetic self-indulgent games playing. The demand for love. Love cannot be demanded, but emotion thinks it can. By facing up to the fact of emotion, by starving the demonic genie out of himself, man can begin to get free of its selfish use of him. Then he can begin to realize and fulfill his two great basic drives for pleasure as self-expression and for love as union. Emotion was created in the first place by the action of sunlight entering and exciting the unconscious psychic mass. Being the first child of light, conceived in the black womb of the unconscious, its prime motivation is to get back up to the external world of sunlight, back to the source of its excitation. Emotion is restless and immature, unseasoned by sufficient experience of the outer world it seeks. Emotion, the demonic genie, rises continuously to the surface through man's senses, not unlike an inquisitive snake out of some underworld. It prefers, if given the chance, to peer through the unsuspecting eyes of the human being into the self-conscious outer world. There it looks for recognition in the world mirror of emotional reaction, the affirming reflection of its existence in some other eyes, face, or attitude. It is this which makes it dangerous to look into the eyes of some dogs unless one intends to deal with them. Our own self-consciousness makes the animal's otherwise purely instinctive reaction emotional. The only protection is to remain perfectly emotionless in one's eyes, a very difficult thing to do. If the animal senses the slightest weakness or fear in the eyes, the presence of self-consciousness, and feels it can win, it will attack. Emotion is a violent energy which cannot resist the opportunity to enslave, hurt, or destroy the emotionally weaker form. It is cannibalistic. It lives off itself. When we catch the eye of a person who is emotional, we instinctively know that they are looking for trouble and to stay clear. Emotion is trouble looking for itself. Emotion in others is fairly easy to discern. In ourselves, it is much more difficult because of the speed with which it takes us over. It is there before we can be aware of it, performing as us in our awareness. If we can manage to race ahead of it, or more realistically, develop the power in ourselves to be present intelligently the moment the emotional genie begins to rise, we can halt it and master it. This without creating frustrations and neuroses which come from bottling up the genie in ignorance. Emotion rises. In primitive man, it carried the waves of instinctive intelligence up and across to the unrealized senses. It pushed and it strained ceaselessly from within to bring the sense of knowing, the sense of self, into the incipient human brain and then into the outer senses. When at last the connection was made linking each outer world sense organ with the physical brain and the vital double within, man's body not only possessed the sense of smell, but man knew he could smell. He was to that degree reflective, and simultaneously his sense of self was born. Emotion creates that self, that I-ness, that past, that karmic, repetitive continuity of effects. That is my body, my emotional feelings, and my now. That past, I, and now rely on memory, and are the spurious creations of an emotion associated with naming. Naming in turn derives from the positional mind, which started to form in primitive man as he approached self-consciousness. With the advent of self-consciousness, man used his positional mind or fixed perceptions in an attempt to interpret and satisfy new emotional feelings or desires as they arose in him. He enjoyed letting past events play on his memory and watching the pictures come up. Gradually, he resorted to the past in this way to deal with the present. and started the positional habit of living in the past, which persists in all men today. This was the origin of the old habit of naming which binds us, and the people we name, to the past and prevents us from breaking out of our narrow, time-bound cage. Naming is a pernicious habit of the emotional self that operates incessantly in man at the conscious and subconscious levels, especially as continuous thinking and worrying. Naming is the reaffirmation and replenishing of the false self's existence. When a man is able to break his dependence on the primitive positional mind and cease this constant naming, it involves a good deal of conscious effort and psychological pain. The false self dies. With it dies the old now, which was his reference to the past, or his living in the past, and his main source of confusion and uncertainty. With the death of this past self, the old enemy emotion, he automatically transfers to a refreshing new sense of time. The moment, the real now. Now he is truly alive, and no longer just living. Now he sees things and people as they are, not as they were. The moment is part of a new factor of awareness currently making an increased appearance in consciousness. It is extremely fine and delicate as yet. Perception of it is immediately clouded over and lost by any emotion or subjective reference to the past. The moment has a purely mental or intelligence base, as opposed to the old self's emotional or irrational base. To exist as a ceaselessly naming individual is obviously not rational. It is emotional, and therefore expendable. In any moment with effort, we can observe the naming habit in ourselves, stifle it, and start to live anew. The unconscious part of the psyche is the world of the living dead, and of our feeling self, the vital double. To us, the dying living, it is symbolized by the inside of the solid body of the earth. It is unconscious because we cannot be conscious of what is in there or what is beyond it. However, to the living dead, whose world it is, it extends out to include the entire area, prescribed by the orbit of the moon. For that, we have to withdraw inward into the unconscious, as when we die, and enter that realm from there. Thus do the dead approach and observe the earth, unbeknownst to us. Each living creature, from individual man to collective organisms, such as hives or insect colonies, is attached to the psyche, like hairs to a scalp. In total, the mass of all living things on the earth at any time covers the psyche, or psychic body, like a short, dense pile. Furthermore, every living thing is a receptor, converter, and battery serving the total evolution of the psyche. The psyche is one vast fluid whole, of which man's vital double is the self-conscious center, its most intelligently developed nucleus. But the relatively enlightened human center is very small compared with the enormous surrounding mass of natural or instinctive ignorance. Instinct, in spite of its superb efficiency as a survival reaction, is ignorant and unenlightened in relation to the movement towards a civilized or moral purpose, which only man among the species consciously reflects. Consequently, the individual man, in spite of his superior intelligence, frequently becomes psychically disturbed by the pressure of the surrounding primitive mass. The dark hours of early morning are often the most anxious and depressing for him. The sufferings of all men and all life that has ever lived are indelibly imprinted on the psyche. The superstitions to which even the most civilized of men are prone have their origins here in the dread of the unknown, which reality is the dread of what the total psychic consciousness has already known. Most nightmares, psychic disorders, and apparent insanity have their source in involuntary perceptions of this red and raw unconscious region of the psyche. The hallucinations that terrorize the schizophrenic are due mostly to these hyperceptions of the psyche, the instinctive and emotional past of man and all the species. Utilization of humans by psychic forces is extremely common. Since the psyche pervades man's brain and every cell of his body, these forces are able to invade the individual's psychic space with imperceptible stealth. They enter from a man's vital double via any emotional abnormality. Their presence excites him further, enabling them to take temporary, sometimes permanent, possession. Just about every negative move or feeling we experience as individuals can be attributed to this type of possession. One stratagem is for the energies to attach themselves to any emotional thinking, which can be induced. Thoughts originate as single-frame flash images which are unavoidable. The danger arises when a single thought is allowed to run on by association. Invariably, it focuses on an emotional point in the past. The psychic forces wait on these thoughts, enter on the emotion, and temporarily influence the moods, decisions, and actions. The psychic energies also attach themselves to man's fears of illness or death, and when he is sick, make conditions worse by causing depression. They also manifest as brooding, paranoia, and hysteria, and attach themselves to such natural and involuntary emotional phenomena as the female menses. Protection against psychic invasion lies in resisting any thought that does not involve the intention of action. When action is the object, such as in preparing a plan for a house or performing work, man reasons from fact to fact and is not emotionally vulnerable. Any other thinking is discursive and carries the danger of invasion. Overindulgence in sex and other excessive sensual or emotional stimulation can provide the necessary catalyst for the psychic forces. This includes overexcitement in anticipation of even normal events, as often happens in children. The after effects of possession, depression, self-pity, tearfulness, pessimism, moodiness, demandingness, lethargy, may not appear until a couple of days later. This again shows the cunning of these emotional entities. The time lapse prevents the person from seeing that his depression is caused by his earlier thinking or excitement. This would undermine the entity's parasitical credibility and existence. Everyone knows that thinking is natural and perfectly harmless, so goes the propaganda. The point of existence is for man as a race to build a new world of his own, and to be fully and permanently responsible for it. It has to be a world in which he is immortal, where his conscious presence and control are uninterrupted. Men of goodwill have sensed this down the ages. Many have imagined it as a hope for the physical world, only to have their efforts ended by death or uncontrollable circumstance. Mystics and saints have perceived it as a life in the spirit of selfless love in which the need for any existence at all disappears. But humanity's future world is neither physical nor spiritual. It is psychic. The epoch has now arrived in which man is to start taking conscious control of the psychic world and his own existence. This will be done by the individual extending his conscious awareness to include that of his vital double in the world of the living dead. Only the clarified consciousness of the individual has the power to unite both living and death worlds to form a new immortal existence. Success by a few will make a stronger bridge for others to follow, and enough across will begin to form a new world. This unification of consciousness has been going on in individual men for thousands of years, but because of its intensely personal demands, rarely is the process seen for what it is, the forerunner of a massed race effort to build a new world for all humanity. A man's vital double, his own immortal self, is as close to him as his feeling of being alive, but he is separated from it by all his negative feelings, moods, fears, and desires. These create the individual's psychic space, separating him from the experience of his immortality. This space becomes the playground for the psychic forces that enter and take possession of it. When a man embarks on clearing his space in earnest, these forces start opposing and afflicting and tormenting him. They are tricky and resourceful, skilled at exploiting emotional weaknesses, particularly fears and doubts and human ignorance of death. Here he can meet the self-willed, perverse, part conscious, part animal, part human, part divine, and part demonic forces that since time began have pressed for self-expression through man and his imagination. Imagination is the battleground, but imagination is not just an abstract fantasy function. The further one gets into the psychic world and towards one's own vital reality, the more imagination becomes psychically substantial. Inner and outer, psyche and space conjoin. Thought lives. Here, approaching the source of the man's vitality, his id, the phantoms actually come to life using his own residual energy, without his suspecting it. Consequently, they are as strong as he is weak as he is strong. Panic is their ultimate strength. A man ceases to be controlled by his imagination only by facing up to death in the psychic world and understanding both. In proportion as he does this, the negative forces are rendered impotent and can no longer afflict him. His space is clear. If a man endeavoring to clear his space is deterred by the psychic forces that oppose and resist him, he certainly will be unable to face up to the reality of himself, his own psychic double. The meeting will without doubt petrify him. It probably will happen at night. A man's psychic double is a living entity, immeasurably more powerful, base, and terrifying in its perceived presence than a man can ever realize until he actually comes face to face with it. This he must eventually do, to gain conscious control of his part of the psychic world. Mediums and clairvoyants may communicate with the world of the dead, but no human being may have conscious control in it while alive until he has confronted and dealt with the gigantic psychic presence of his own living past, the accumulation of a billion years, the door to life and reality.